What is going on, everybody? King Arthur here. Today we're going to be taking an extremely in-depth look at how specialists charge in Black Ops 4 Zombies. So I spent the better part of 7 hours yesterday testing every factor I could think of when it came to specialist use, and I found a ton of interesting things that I think will benefit most every Zombies player that watches this. So, without further ado, let's get into it. We all know what specialists are. They're the super strong weapons that you get to take into every game with you that can absolutely decimate zombies and completely change the flow of your game. Of course, weapons this strong should come with a catch, and Treyarch wisely made it so that you must charge up these weapons between uses. So the first thing I tested for was an actual difference between the specialist charge rates, and for the most part I found that regardless of which specialists you have equipped, the charge rate tends to be roughly the same. There is no discernible difference in charge rate between the specialists. They all seem to take the same amount to charge, so don't be scared to pick your favorite specialist, as there will be no difference in charge rate in-game. The next thing I wanted to find out was whether points or kills were the main factor in getting that charge up. And after a lot of testing, it has become crystal clear to me that points are the deciding factor here. Now, clearly, points are going to come with kills, and that's why it's been a common misconception that you need specifically kills to charge your specialist, but that is not the case. Theoretically, one can charge their specialist entirely by rebuilding barriers and shooting into hordes for points, but never killing a single zombie. That said, one phenomenon I found was that double points, bonus points, carpenters, and nukes have zero effect on your specialist charge, and they are totally ignored when the game calculates your charge. Even with double points, your charge rate will remain the same as if double points weren't active at all, so that's something to keep in mind. Another thing I tested for was if there was a difference between the levels of the specialists and their charge rate, and I found that regardless of if your specialist is level 1, 2, or 3, the charge rate will not be affected. Another thing to note here is that specialists last exactly 15 seconds when they're taken out, so regardless of if you're killing them or just walking around wasting charge, it will always take 15 seconds to deplete a full charge. I'm not sure how helpful that knowledge is, but there you go. Now, let's finally talk about the real meat and potatoes of this video, and that is how to determine how many points one needs to charge their specialist. In testing, I found that in the beginning of a game, your charge will always be a cakewalk, but as the rounds progressed, it would become harder and harder to obtain that full charge. This immediately made itself clear to me, and at first I lazily concluded that rounds are the main factor in deciding your charge, but after a grueling 4-hour testing session, I found that this is not the case entirely. The gameplay you've been watching here is of me testing for this exact factor. I wanted to find out whether or not the amount of times you use your specialist in a game has an effect on your charge, and I found that the answer was pretty obvious as rounds increased. The main variable here is number of times used, not rounds survived. I found that even on rounds that didn't change, my specialist would take roughly 50 points more to achieve after each use. That isn't the final conclusion, however, but because I also found that rounds do in fact play a role as well, meaning that your specialist charge rate is not your simple slope-form equation. It is a multi-variable system that takes into account the amount of rounds you survived, as well as how often you've used your specialist in that particular game. What I observed was that on round 21, it took roughly 3,100 points to achieve my specialist, and each subsequent charge took roughly 50 points more. Then the round started changing, and I was totally confused by what happened next. A charge that took 3,100, then 3,150 on round 21 ended up taking about 3,210 the next round, then ending that round with another charge that took 3,270. On round 23, it became very clear that something odd was happening here. My first charge on round 23 took about 3,560 points, which was a decent jump from 3,270. The 50 to 60 point increase can always be explained by number of times you've used your specialist, but there's clearly about 200 points that aren't being accounted for here. As rounds progressed, this trend was becoming more and more apparent until round 29, where my final recording was 4,600 points. So instead of continuing through the 30s with the same strategy, I instead pocketed my specialist for 5 rounds until 35, where I discovered that a full charge took 5,020 points. What does this mean? It means that yes, while number of times you've used your specialist does have an effect, number of rounds survived also has an effect, and possibly even a greater one than the former. That 420 point jump can only be explained by the game's coding, factoring in a difference in the rounds because I didn't use my specialist at any point in between. Since we advanced 5 rounds without using the specialist and it took 400 more points, we can assume that each round adds roughly 80 points to your specialist charge cap, meaning that both variables have roughly the same effect, however rounds are slightly more important. From this, I have created a very rough equation to define specialist charge, and it is as follows. I'm not sure the accuracy is 100% by any means, but after all my testing, this is my best estimate. Basically, specialist charge equals number of times you've used your specialist times 50, plus number of rounds survived times 60, plus about 1,000 points. This is why in early game your specialist charges extremely quickly, but later on that rate starts to become quite tedious. That's the most major finding of this video, and I know the equation is inaccurate, but I would love to get the community interested in this topic, and maybe together we can figure out what is happening here. If anyone has any ideas, please drop a comment and let's get brainstorming. Lastly, I wanted to cover a couple other main notes regarding specialist charge. Time slip. Contrary to what I said in my time slip video, actually only charges your specialist 17% faster, which is still extremely viable and helpful, but not quite as high as 20%. Sorry for the inaccuracy, guys. Arsenal accelerator is another thing that helps your specialist charge faster, but it only charges about 8 to 10% faster, which is alright, but not exactly worthy of an elixir spot, especially since it only lasts 2 minutes and its recharge time is garbage. But there you go. There's some things you didn't know. Alright guys, that is all for me. If you learned something or if you feel as though I did a good job investigating, I always appreciate a like. If you have any further ideas regarding specialists, please don't hesitate to comment. I'm going to read all of them and I would love to get this figured out. For more informational zombies videos in the future, feel free to hit that subscribe button. Alright, that's King Arthur signing off. Stay royal everyone. Peace.